June 2nd, 1944. Somewhere along the windswept coast of Dover, England. The cliffs rise pale and ancient against a slate-gray sky. Below, along the harbor, shadows move in the predawn light shapes that appear to be men. Machines, convoys preparing for something immense. Through the lens of German reconnaissance aircraft circling at 15,000 feet, the scene unfolds with mechanical precision. Sherman tanks positioned in neat rows, their hulls dark and solid against the chalk landscape. Half-tracks clustered near warehouses. Artillery pieces angled toward the Strait of Dover, their barrels catching the weak morning sun. Landing craft bob in the harbor like seeds ready to scatter across the channel. The camera shutters click. The film advances. The intelligence officers in Calais will study these photographs within hours. And they will see exactly what they expect to see, the gathering storm of invasion pointed directly at the Pas de Calais. The shortest crossing, the most logical target. What they cannot see, what no photograph can reveal, is that nearly everything below is a lie. The tanks are rubber. The artillery pieces are painted canvas, stretched over wooden frames. The landing craft are inflatable decoys. The radio chatter crackling through the German listening posts speaks of divisions that exist only in ledgers and phantom command structures. This is not a military operation. This is theater. This is the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The Ghost Army, and they are staging the most elaborate deception in the history of modern warfare. 1,100 men, actors and artists and engineers, armed not with rifles but with compressors and amplifiers and brushes, creating an illusion so convincing that it will pin 15 German divisions to the wrong beaches, while the real invasion unfolds 150 miles to the west. In the careful orchestration of shadows and sound, in the inflation of rubber and the broadcast of fiction, these men will save tens of thousands of lives without firing a single shot. They will fight the war with imagination, and they will win battles that never happened. The story of how America came to wage war with art begins not in the fields of Europe, but in the desperate mathematics of 1942. By then, the Allied command understood a fundamental truth that would shape every operation until Berlin fell. Deception was not auxiliary to warfare. It was essential to survival. The Germans held Fortress Europe with meticulous efficiency, their Atlantic wall studied with artillery positions, their armored divisions positioned to respond with crushing speed to any landing. A direct assault without misdirection would be slaughter. The British had pioneered tactical deception in North Africa, where an officer named Jasper Masculina, stage magician before the war, had hidden tanks under false trucks and created entire phantom bases in the desert. His techniques were primitive but effective. Make the enemy look where nothing waits while the real blow comes from the blind side. The Americans, arriving late to the theater, but rich in industrial capacity and unorthodox thinking, saw the potential to industrialize deception itself, to manufacture illusion on a scale that matched their production of steel and aircraft. In January 1944, as winter locked northern Europe in frost and mud, the order came down through channels so classified that most of the army never knew it existed. Assemble a unit capable of impersonating entire divisions, of creating ghost armies that could deceive German intelligence from the ground and the air simultaneously. The requirements were bizarre, almost absurd. They needed soldiers who could paint and sculpt, engineers who understood acoustics and theater staging, radio operators capable of mimicking the communications patterns of units they'd never met. The recruitment officers scoured art schools and advertising agencies, radio stations and theater companies. They found fashion designers from New York and landscape painters from New England, sound engineers from Hollywood studios and set designers from Broadway productions. Men who had never fired a rifle were handed the insignia of the United States Army and told they would be fighting with deception as their weapon. Most of them had no idea what they were being recruited for until they arrived at Camp Forest in Tennessee, where the training began in secrecy, behind barbed wire and armed guards. What they learned there was the vocabulary of phantom warfare. They studied the German reconnaissance patterns, the altitude and angles at which Luftwaffe cameras operated, the resolution limits of aerial photography. They learned that from 15,000 feet, a tank and a perfect replica of a tank were indistinguishable if the replica cast the right shadow, held the correct dimensions, positioned itself with military logic. They practiced inflating rubber tanks' massive hollow sculptures that weighed 100 pounds but appeared, from above, to weigh 30 tons. 4 men could carry a Sherman tank on their shoulders, moving it into position like stagehands, adjusting props between acts. They learned to paint canvas artillery pieces that looked weathered and used, to age their fakes with mud and wear, so that German analysts studying photographs would see not theatrical props but genuine military hardware. They studied the semiotics of military presence, how tanks parked in relation to supply depots, how command posts positioned themselves relative to artillery batteries, how the entire grammar of an armored division's layout could be forged if you understood the syntax of war, but visual deception was only half the arsenal. The Ghost Army's most sophisticated weapon was sound. The Army contracted with Bell Laboratories, the same engineers who were revolutionizing telecommunications, to create sonic deception equipment unlike anything attempted before. The result was a collection of modified half-ton trucks equipped with massive speakers and wire recorders, capable of projecting sound across distances of 15 miles under the right atmospheric conditions. The recordings themselves were masterpieces of audio engineering, the grinding rumble of Sherman tank treads, the distinctive whine of half-track transmissions, the clank and rattle of towed artillery, the voices of officers shouting coordinates, the general cacophony of mechanized units preparing to move. Each sound was recorded with forensic precision at real Army bases, then mixed and layered so that a single truck parked in darkness could project the acoustic signature of an entire battalion on the move. In the Pennsylvania woods, they practiced these symphonies of deception, playing the sounds of phantom convoys while observers, miles away, tried to estimate unit size and composition based solely on what they heard. The illusion was flawless. The Germans, masters of signals intelligence, would hear exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to hear, the approach of overwhelming force where nothing real existed. The radio operators, meanwhile, became method actors of the electromagnetic spectrum. They studied the communication patterns of real divisions, the rhythm and frequency of transmissions, the distinctive fist of individual telegraph operators, the coded language and call signs that identified units. Then they mimicked these patterns with perfect fidelity, broadcasting scripted conversations that created the radio signature of divisions that existed only as code names and organizational charts. A handful of men with transmitters could create the illusion of an entire corps preparing for operations, their phantom messages flooding the channels that German listening posts monitored obsessively. The deception was layered, redundant, mutually reinforcing. What the Germans saw from the air matched what they heard on the ground, and both matched what their signals intelligence intercepted over the radio waves. The separate streams of intelligence all pointed to the same conclusion, and that conclusion was fiction. They shipped to England in early May 1944, crossing the Atlantic in convoy, while the final preparations for Operation Overlord consumed every available resource in the European theater. The Ghost Army knew they were arriving for something immense, though the details remained classified even from them. They established their base in England and waited for orders. These artists and engineers and sound technicians who would never storm a beach, but whose work would determine whether those who did would survive the landing. The plan that emerged was breathtaking in its ambition and its audacity. While the real invasion force gathered along the southern coast of England, the actual tanks and artillery, the millions of tons of supplies, the 150,000 men who would cross the channel on Didatha Ghost Army, would create a phantom force along the eastern coast. A massive fictional army group poised to strike at Calais. The deception had a name: Operation Fortitude South. Its goal was to convince Hitler and his high command that Normandy, when the invasion came, was merely a diversion, that the real blow would fall at the narrowest point of the channel, and that Germany must hold its reserves near Calais even as the Allies established their beachhead 150 miles away. The scope was staggering. The Ghost Army would simulate the first United States Army group, Fusega, a fictional force of 1 million men that existed only in German intelligence reports. They would position their rubber tanks in inflatable artillery in patterns that aerial reconnaissance would photograph and analyze. They would broadcast radio traffic suggesting massive troop concentrations and supply operations. They would park their sound trucks near the coast and play the recordings of mechanized divisions on maneuvers, ensuring that German acoustic surveillance detected the approach of armored formations. And they would do all of this while maintaining perfect operational security. Because if a single German agent glimpsed the hollow interiors of their tanks or touched the canvas of their artillery, the entire deception would collapse, and the real invasion force would face German reserves that should have been pinned elsewhere. The stakes were absolute. Tens of thousands of lives depended on whether a handful of artists could convince the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in the world that rubber and canvas were steel and death. The Germans believed because the Germans wanted to believe. Every analysis of Allied intentions pointed to Calais as the logical invasion point. Shortest crossing, direct route to the Ruhr industrial region, proximity to German territory. The Allied deception planners understood this cognitive bias and exploited it ruthlessly. They fed the Germans intelligence that confirmed their assumptions, captured documents that mentioned Calais, double agents who reported phantom troop movements, the physical evidence of the Ghost Army's presence along the Dover coast. Through ultra intercepts the Allies' secret ability to read German crypted communications, the deception planners watched in real time as German intelligence accepted the fiction. As reports of the Phantom Fusag climbed the chain of command, as Hitler himself studied maps showing the massive concentration of Allied forces aimed at Calais, the Ghost Army's fake tanks appeared in German intelligence estimates as real divisions. Their radio chatter was transcribed and analyzed by German signals units who never suspected they were listening to theater. The sound of their recorded tank movements was reported by coastal observers as evidence of armored buildups. The illusion became reality in the German operational planning, a shared hallucination that would prove catastrophic. When June 6 dawned and the shells began falling on Normandy, after the beaches were won, at terrible cost, and the lodgment secured, the Ghost Army crossed the Channel and began the work that would define their legend. They moved through France in the wake of the advancing Allied armies, not fighting but deceiving, staging operation after operation to mislead German intelligence about Allied strength and intentions. Near Brest in September 1944, they impersonated the 2nd Armored Division, positioning their rubber tanks and broadcasting fake radio traffic to convince the Germans that a massive armored force was preparing to assault the city's fortifications. The actual 2nd Armored had moved south, racing toward the German border, but the Ghost Army held their positions for 2 weeks, maintaining the illusion so perfectly that the German garrison remained pinned inside Brest, waiting for an attack that never came. The city fell eventually to other units. But by then, the real 2nd Armored was 200 miles away, exploiting German weakness elsewhere. The Ghost Army had traded rubber for time, illusion for strategic mobility. They operated in the forests of Luxembourg during the bitter winter of 1944, creating the sonic deception that covered the movement of the 4th Armored Division. While Patton's tanks raced to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, the Ghost Army played their recordings of armored columns in the darkness, projecting the sound toward German lines, creating the illusion that the American forces were massing in positions they had already abandoned. German artillery fired on empty woods, or shells falling on coordinates where the Ghost Army's Phantom tanks had been reported. The sound trucks moved through the night like phantoms themselves, their speakers blasting the roar of diesel engines and grinding treads, then disappearing before dawn. The Germans adjusted their intelligence maps, marking American positions that were fiction, leaving gaps in their coverage where the real attacks came through in the spring of 1945. As the Allied armies drove into the heart of Germany, the Ghost Army staged what would become their final major operation. They impersonated the 9th Army near the Rhine, creating a phantom crossing that drew German reserves toward a fictitious bridgehead, while the real assault came miles upstream. They inflated their rubber boats and positioned their fake equipment under camouflage netting that was just porous enough to be penetrated by aerial reconnaissance. They broadcast urgent radio messages about engineering challenges and supply shortages. It's a kind of authentic military communication that German intelligence had learned to trust. And when the German reserves moved to counter the phantom threat, the real Ninth Army crossed against weakened defenses, suffering casualties far lighter than the planners had projected. The Ghost Army packed their equipment and moved on, following the advancing front, leaving behind no monument and no acknowledgement. Their success measured in battles that were easier than they should have been, and in soldiers who came home because German. Bullets were aimed at shadows. The men who operated these deceptions understood that they were waging a strange and morally complex form of warfare. They were artists enlisted to create death by misdirection. Every German shell that fell on a phantom tank position was a shell that didn't fall on real soldiers. But it also meant that somewhere, because resources were misallocated, other Germans might die fighting the wrong battle. They painted fake invasion stripes on rubber tanks and felt the absurdity of it. The disconnect between the military violence erupting around them and the theatrical nature of their own work. They carried no weapons beyond sidearms. If they were overrun, their rubber props would offer no protection. Their survival depended on the enemy believing the lie completely, on never getting close enough to touch the canvas artillery or peer inside the inflatable holes. They worked at night, mostly moving their equipment under cover of darkness, positioning their props with the care of museum curators, arranging an exhibition where every piece had to be precisely placed or the entire installation would fail. At dawn, they would withdraw and wait, hoping the German reconnaissance flights would photograph exactly what they had staged, that the analysts studying those photographs would see divisions where only deception existed. There was a recurring object in their work, a symbol that appeared again and again in the staging of these phantom armies: the fuel drum. Real or fake, the 55-gallon steel drums appeared in every military installation, stacked near motor pools and supply depots, the mundane infrastructure of mechanized warfare. The Ghost Army fabricated thousands of dummy fuel dumps, plywood barrels painted to match the real thing, arranged in mathematically precise stacks that aerial photographs would interpret as evidence of massive supply operations. The fuel drum became their signature, the object that signified American abundance, the industrial capacity to project power across oceans and sustain armies thousands of miles from home. When German intelligence analysts saw the ghost fuel dumps and reconnaissance photographs, they saw what they feared: the bottomless logistics of American material superiority. The ability to keep tank divisions running through fuel supply chains that never exhausted. The irony was precise. The Ghost Army's fake fuel drums represented a real truth about American power. The industrial abundance that allowed the United States to manufacture rubber tanks by the hundreds, to waste resources on deception at a scale that no other nation could afford, was the same abundance that kept real tanks rolling toward Berlin. While German armor sat immobilized for lack of gasoline, the transformation in German military thinking came not from a single revelation but from the accumulation of deceptions, the slow erosion of confidence in their own intelligence. By late 1944, after months of Ghost Army operations and broader Allied deception efforts, German commanders faced a crisis of perception. They had learned to doubt their reconnaissance reports, to question whether the divisions they saw on maps existed or were phantoms. This uncertainty, this cognitive paralysis, was perhaps the Ghost Army's greatest achievement. In warfare, hesitation is fatal. An enemy who cannot trust their intelligence cannot act decisively. The Germans began holding reserves longer, waiting for confirmation that never came with certainty, paralyzed by the possibility that any move might be a reaction to Allied deception rather than Allied reality. In the forests and fields where the Ghost Army worked, this translated into a kind of strategic checkmate. The Germans knew they were being deceived, but couldn't determine where the deception ended and reality began. Every Allied movement might be genuine or might be theater. The uncertainty pinned German units in place as effectively as actual combat, with the crucial difference that American casualties remained a fiction. Documented records from German intelligence archives recovered after the war reveal the extent of the success. Major General Walther Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Wehrmacht Operations, wrote in post-war interrogations that German intelligence had identified Fusag as the most significant Allied army group in Britain before D-Day, a force that had to be countered at Calais. The actual Fusag, the Ghost, commanded by no one, equipped with rubber and radio scripts, had achieved strategic reality in German planning. Rommel positioned the 15th Army along the Pas-de-Calais coast. 15 divisions that could have turned the tide at Normandy. If they had been committed on June 6th, they remained at Calais for weeks after the invasion, waiting for the Ghost Army's phantom forces to materialize, kept in place by a deception so complete that even after the Normandy landings, German high command believed the main blow had yet to fall. Intelligence estimates captured by advancing Allied forces showed Ghost Army units marked as genuine threats on German operational maps. Their rubber tanks translated into symbols representing armored divisions that required German armored responses. The war was fought partially in the imagination and in that theater. The artists and engineers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were winning battles that generals never saw, yet the men themselves expected something different when they joined this strange unit. They were artists, most of them accustomed to creation for its own sake, for beauty or commerce or personal expression. They expected, perhaps, to use their skills in support roles designing propaganda posters, camouflaging installations, maybe entertaining troops. Instead, they found themselves weaponizing their art, turning their creative training into implements of military deception. The Fashion Institute students who could sketch perfectly found themselves painting weathering effects on canvas artillery. The sound engineers who had recorded symphony orchestras were now mixing the acoustics of tank battalions. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They were creating to destroy, or rather, creating to prevent creation elsewhere. Their fake tanks meant real tanks faced weaker opposition. There was an ethical simplicity to it that was also troubling. Every successful deception operation saved Allied lives. But it also meant that German soldiers died fighting the wrong battle, misled by what the Ghost Army had staged. The men didn't speak about this much, according to the interviews conducted decades later. They focused on the technical challenges, the craft of deception, the satisfaction of staging an operation so perfectly that German intelligence swallowed it completely. But underneath ran the awareness that their art was killing. Even if their hands never touched a weapon, what they actually experienced was something closer to guerrilla theater than conventional military service. They lived in the gap between frontline combat and rear-echelon safety, close enough to hear artillery, but rarely engaged directly, moving through landscapes recently torn by battle to stage their deceptions before the situation changed again. They worked with frantic speed. An entire Phantom division had to be positioned, aged, made convincing within 24 hours. Sometimes less. They inflated tanks in darkness, while artillery rumbled in the distance. They painted mud and wear onto canvas guns while sniper fire cracked through the trees a mile away. They strung camouflage netting over rubber equipment, while German reconnaissance planes circled overhead. The success of the entire operation depended on whether those pilots' cameras captured the right angles, the right shadows, the illusion of substance where only air and fabric existed. The stress was constant and peculiar, not the terror of combat, but the anxiety of performance. The knowledge that a single mistake in staging, a poorly placed prop, or an unconvincing detail could cause the deception to fail and real soldiers to die. Because German forces were positioned where they shouldn't be, they adapted. The way soldiers always adapt? The fashion designers became expert in the visual grammar of military wear, knowing exactly how tanks weathered in different climates, how equipment degraded under use, what a motor pool looked like after a division had occupied it for 2 weeks versus 2 days. The sound engineers developed an intuitive sense for how audio propagated across different terrain, learning to position their speakers to account for wind and humidity and ground composition, turning the landscape itself into an amplifier for their recorded deceptions. They became craftsmen of a strange and specialized art form that would disappear with the war's end. Their skills suddenly obsolete in a world where deception at this scale would never be attempted again. After the war, they would return to commercial design and advertising. to painting and sculpture and sound recording, carrying with them the knowledge that they had once created lies so perfect that armies moved in response, that their art had altered the outcome of battles they never fought. The symbolism of the inflatable tank. The Ghost Army's most iconic prop resonated beyond its immediate tactical function. Here was American industrial capacity reduced to its essence, the ability to manufacture imitation at scale, to produce hundreds of rubber tanks not because they were needed for combat, but because they were needed for theater, because the United States could afford to divert resources to deception that other nations had to spend on actual weapons. The inflatable tank represented a kind of post-scarcity warfare, conflict waged by a nation wealthy enough to create elaborate fictions alongside its genuine military might. When German intelligence officers studied photographs of these rubber props, believing them real, they were confronting the fundamental asymmetry of the war. America could fight with both substance and shadow, could field actual armored divisions while also manufacturing phantom ones, could wage war in reality and in carefully constructed illusions simultaneously. The fake tank was more threatening in some ways than the real one, because it represented an enemy that could afford to deceive on an industrial scale, that had resources so abundant that deception itself became a manufactured commodity by April 1945. As the Ghost Army staged their final operations along the Rhine, the character of their deceptions had evolved. The Germans were collapsing, their intelligence networks fragmenting, their capacity to analyze and respond to Allied movements degrading daily. The Ghost Army's rubber tanks faced less sophisticated reconnaissance now. Their radio deceptions encountered German signals units that were overwhelmed and demoralized. The deceptions still worked German forces still repositioned in response to phantom threats, but the satisfaction was different. In 1944, they'd been matching wits with the Wehrmacht at the height of its organizational capability, creating illusions sophisticated enough to fool intelligence analysts who were expert at their craft. Now they were deceiving an enemy that was already defeated, whose collapse was a matter of time rather than possibility. The Ghost Army packed their equipment as Germany surrendered, shipping their rubber tanks and sound trucks and radio equipment back to depots in France and England, props from a theater production that had run its course. Most of the equipment was destroyed or supplused after the war. The recordings of tank sounds were erased and the wire reused. The canvas artillery pieces rotted in storage. The entire apparatus of the Ghost Army dissolved into military bureaucracy and classified files. For decades, their story remained secret. The soldiers returned home under orders not to discuss their service, not to reveal the deceptions they had staged or the techniques they had pioneered. The official histories of the European campaign made no mention of the Ghost Army. Their operations buried in classified annexes that researchers couldn't access. The men returned to their civilian careers, and most of them kept the secret, occasionally gathering in small reunions where they could speak freely about what they had done, sharing memories of inflating tanks in darkness and playing recordings of phantom armies while real war raged nearby. It was not until the 1990s, when the operations were finally declassified, that the full scope of what they had achieved became public knowledge. Historians studying the newly released documents realized that the Ghost Army had conducted more than 20 major tactical deceptions, that their operations had directly influenced the outcomes of multiple campaigns, that their rubber tanks and recorded sounds had saved an estimated 30,000 Allied lives by causing German forces to misposition and mislocate their defensive resources. Epilogue to the Ghost Army's story is written not in military victory, but in the questions their existence raises about the nature of warfare and truth. They prove that in modern conflict, perception can be as decisive as firepower. That an enemy who believes a lie will act on that lie with the same commitment they would bring to truth. The rubber tank and the real tank produced identical effects in German planning. Both caused redeployment of forces. Both generated intelligence assessments. Both shaped operational decisions. The distinction between genuine and counterfeit collapsed at the level of command where battles were planned and resources allocated. This was a new kind of warfare, one that recognized that military conflict occurred not just in physical space but in the cognitive, space of intelligence and perception. And that dominating that cognitive space could produce strategic effects as significant as winning ground battles. In the forests of Luxembourg and the fields of France, where the Ghost Army positioned their props and played their recordings, there are no monuments. The ground remembers nothing of the deceptions staged there. The rubber tanks that briefly occupied positions before being deflated and moved, the local populations who might have glimpsed the operations were mostly evacuated. The combat zones emptied of civilians who might notice that the American tanks were hollow, or that the artillery pieces were canvas. The war moved on, real battles replacing the staged ones. And the Ghost Army followed behind the front, always in the wake of genuine combat, cleaning up after the real soldiers by creating phantom forces that would mislead the next German response. Their legacy exists in archives and declassified documents, in the interviews with surviving members conducted before they died, in the handful of photographs that show the rubber tanks mid-inflation or the sound trucks with their speakers exposed. It exists most significantly in the negative space of military history. In the German divisions that weren't where they should have been, in the battles that were less costly than projected, in the invasion that succeeded because the enemy's strongest reserves were pinned to beaches where nothing came. The larger truth the Ghost Army embodied was about the relationship between democracy and deception, between transparency and necessary secrecy. These men, mostly artists and civilians in temperament, had been recruited into an organization whose entire purpose was to lie with perfection. They succeeded because American society had produced them, had educated them in art schools and trained them in commercial fields where creativity was valued, had developed in them the skills that could be weaponized into military deception. The totalitarian efficiency of Germany, for all its legendary organization, couldn't produce what the Ghost Army represented: the harnessing of individual creativity toward collective deception, the transformation of artistic training into military advantage. The American abundance they symbolized was not just material, not just the steel and fuel and industrial output, but creative. The capacity to imagine and implement deceptions that required improvisational thinking and aesthetic judgment. The rubber tank was a weapon that only a democracy could forge, because only a democracy would recruit fashion designers into its army and trust them to deceive the enemy with painted canvas. When the survivors of the Ghost Army spoke about their service in later years, they described it with a mixture of pride and strangeness. They had served in combat zones, but mostly without combat. They had influenced major battles without firing shots. They had created art that no one was meant to appreciate as art deception so successful that their audience never realized. They were watching a performance. One veteran, a painter before and after the war, described the experience as creating to uncreate, making things whose purpose was to prevent other things from being made, staging scenes whose success was measured by whether the enemy believed them real and acted accordingly. Another, a sound engineer, spoke about the ethical simplicity of it. Every shell that hit where we weren't was a shell that didn't hit where we were. The moral calculus was clean in its way their deceptions saved lives by causing the enemy to waste resources fighting phantoms. But underneath was the awareness that they had participated in a kind of warfare that dissolved the boundaries between truth and fiction, where reality became a tactical choice rather than a given condition. The Ghost Army dissolved into history, their techniques studied by military intelligence services and then largely abandoned as warfare evolved into something faster and more technological, where satellite reconnaissance could penetrate deceptions that fooled aerial photography, where signals intelligence became sophisticated enough to distinguish genuine radio traffic from scripted performances. The age of the rubber tank passed quickly, its brief relevance a product of a specific moment when reconnaissance technology had advanced enough to make visual deception. It's necessary, but not so far that it made visual deception impossible. For a few years, between the development of aerial photography and the development of synthetic aperture radar, there existed a gap where illusion could be manufactured at scale and made to withstand scrutiny. The Ghost Army occupied that gap with mastery, and then the gap closed behind them. What remains is the story itself. The documentation of how 1,000 artists fought the Second World War with creativity as their weapon, how they staged deceptions that altered the course of campaigns, how they proved that in warfare, as in theater, the appearance of reality can produce effects indistinguishable from reality itself. Their legacy is written in the absence of casualties, in the battles that were easier than they should have been. In the German intelligence reports that marked phantom divisions as genuine threats, they saved lives through imagination, won battles through fiction, influenced the war's outcome through the careful construction of lies that the enemy desperately wanted to believe. In the final accounting of the war, their contribution was as significant as any combat units, measured not in ground taken or enemies killed, but in the broader, strategic effects of making the enemy see what wasn't there and respond to threats that existed only in rubber and canvas and carefully scripted radio transmissions. On a June morning in 1944, German reconnaissance cameras photographed an invasion force that didn't exist, and that photograph changed history. The Ghost Army understood what the cameras could not see, that warfare had become as much about perception as about steel, that the battle for intelligence and interpretation could determine the outcome of physical combat, that a lie told with sufficient craft could move divisions and save armies. They won the war in part by fighting it in a dimension where bullets were irrelevant and casualties were illusions, where victory came from making the enemy believe the wrong story with absolute conviction. This was their contribution, their strange and essential role in the machinery of victory. They were the soldiers who fought with shadows, who turned creativity into strategy, who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that deceives so perfectly that the enemy destroys himself fighting ghosts. In the history of warfare, they remain unique, the army that never was, commanded by artists, equipped with rubber and canvas, fighting battles that never happened, and winning them all.